Cause you to believe that George Zimmerman was acting in self-defense that night?
Well, we're not going to do that, but let me do this in terms of the specifics that we do know. And I just want to connect a few dots. And all of these dots are already out there. This is nothing special and brand new. You just got to connect them. Question one was, is George Martin a racist? That may not be the first question in order of things happening, but it's one of the big questions that's out there in the court of public opinion. The evidence is that he comes from a racially diverse family. His mother was Peruvian. He mentored two young African-American children, he and his wife. When the funding for that ran out, they spent their own money to do that. That will be able to be confirmed. Took the young boy down to see Dwight Howard. They took him to other special activities. Doesn't sound like the activities of a racist who's out there trying to hunt people down. He's not a member of the Aryan Nation, if you will. He's got friends, including Joe Oliver, who was brave enough to come forward and stand up for him. He's got other African-American friends who, frankly, were afraid for their jobs and their safety to come forward in light of the public furor that has been raised in this case. There's absolutely no evidence, direct evidence whatsoever that he's a racist. Well, but he made 40 phone calls. Yeah, he's a neighborhood watch guy. He does that. Well, we found 17 of them, and like 8 or 9 of them, the guy turned out to be black. Well, that's true, and in every single instance he was asked, just like in this one, does he look white, Hispanic, or black? And he said, yeah, he looks black. It's not like, oh my God, there's a black guy in the neighborhood, send the cops. There's no evidence whatsoever from the time that the earth cooled through right this minute that George Zimmerman ever has been or is racially motivated to go and stalk somebody, racially profile them, or as a congressman said, hunt him down like a dog and shoot him in the street. There's nothing to support that. Here's what the facts show. The facts as the statement given by George Zimmerman the night that he talked to the police, a story repeated by his father, a story repeated by his brother, and you say, well, they're all in on it. Really? Guess what? The absence of witnesses to the contrary doesn't mean that it happened the way you would rather have the context come out. So the only living eyewitness to exactly what happened is George Zimmerman. He's been consistent, and the evidence is consistent with what he said. I'm sorry. We had the situation where we have the eyewitness that says the guy in the red sweater was on the ground, the other guy was on top of him beating him, and the guy on the bottom was yelling for help. He looked at me and asked me to get help. I went in to call 911 for the guy in the orange sweater. We know who that was. It's George Zimmerman. And while I was inside trying to call 911, I heard the pop. Nobody but George Zimmerman purports to know the most important 2 or 3 seconds in the entire incident, and that's who swung on who first. Zimmerman says, and you hear part of this on the 911 tape, I'm following the guy because as I'm on the way out to go grocery shopping on Sunday evening at Target, I see this guy. It's getting dark. He's over 6 feet tall. He doesn't say that, but that's what he sees. He's kind of slinking along behind the back of the buildings. If you've seen the photograph, there's a sidewalk that goes between 2 sets of townhouses, and here's this guy that he doesn't recognize. He's a neighborhood watch guy. He knows his neighbors. Doesn't recognize him in a gated neighborhood. Doesn't mean he's doing anything illegal, but if you're in the rain, in the dark, going along the back side of residences with no apparent purpose, it's at least suspicious enough to take a moment to check it out. He calls the police.
You can see somebody from behind the townhouse from your car, which is on the other side.
I'm sorry, say that again?
How could he have possibly seen somebody from behind the townhouses from his car, which is on the other side of the next building? You can't see behind him.
At some point in time, he sees him, and let's say this. We know from what he said while he's on the phone with 911, and the purported call with the girlfriend, who as far as I know nobody's talked to, she's the one that says, he said, it's raining, I'm getting up by the buildings. If you look at the buildings, the overhang is about this much. Unless you're up against the building sliding along, you're not getting any protection from that. That's nonsense. No, let me finish first. All right? So at any rate, he goes down this sidewalk, and we hear the 911 tape. They say, are you following him? Yes. Well, we don't need you to do that. That's reported as he was ordered to stop. No, they said, we don't need you to do that. And his answer was, okay. He then talks to them, and much of this was cut off of the 911 tape. He says, okay, I think actually ask him, see if you can get an address. If you're not going to follow him, when the cops get there, can you tell him where he went? So he goes down the sidewalk, gets the address, and he's headed back to his car when, according to him, he's accosted by Trayvon Martin. He turns him around, says, do you have a problem with me? He says no, and in response to which Trayvon Martin, in a horrible exercise of bad judgment, says, well, you do now, and hit him in the nose, which we later turned out broke his nose, dropped him to the ground, got on top of him, and he's hitting him. We've had people say, well, how do you explain the fact that Trayvon Martin is face down and George Zimmerman standing up? This doesn't take rocket science. George Zimmerman's still alive. That's why he's standing up. And the reason that Trayvon is face down is because George was on his back and Trayvon was face down on top of him when he got shot and fell the rest of the way down. There's no great mystery here unless you start with the conclusion and try to work back to put it in context the way you want it. Too much of that has taken place. You're going to find that there's injuries to the back of his head. Forget the foggy tape at the police department. The EMTs will have a report in there that they treated him. They cleaned up the blood. His nose really is broken. You're likely, I would suppose, to find grass stains on the bottom of George Zimmerman's clothing and not on Trayvon's. There's all kinds of evidence that they may have forensically that we don't have access to. We're not entitled to it. You're not entitled to it. But all the evidence that has come out is consistent with the story that George Zimmerman has told. It is inconsistent with the storyline that the family, I don't know about what the family really wants to believe, but we've had some people come to town who are only relevant in an area of racial strife. On February 26th, that Sunday morning, most of us went to church and sat in mixed congregations, and we didn't think we were in a community of seething racial violence and tension. Sunday night, all of a sudden, after this incident happens, people start coming to town who frankly have a business model based on driving division in racial communities. They've been making speeches, having rallies, pumping their fists in the air, setting out, bounties for people. No justice, no peace. But as long as justice is defined as arrest him right now, actually had an attorney for the Martin family, who as far as we know actually went to law school, get on the air and say they need to just go ahead and arrest him and let him prove his innocence in a court of law. Really? In the United States? I don't think so. So anyhow, your question was, why do we think he's got a good self-defense? It's been mentioned before, those who followed it all, the Liam Neeson's situation of his wife falling once in the snow, hits her head, dies. There was a guy recently beaten at a baseball game. He's now taking the rest of his food for the rest of his life through a straw or an IV. Shaking babies. When you shake you can't shake me, I'm too fat. But if you get me on the ground, you can hit my head into it and accomplish the same thing, which is to smack my brain around inside the skull. That would put any reasonable person in reasonable fear of serious physical injury, and under Florida law, that entitles you to use any force, including deadly force, to defend yourself. In this case, a gun was used. People say, well, how can you shoot an unarmed man? You know what? The unarmed man can kill you if he continues doing what he's already doing.
Is it true enough that the lead investigator didn't buy the story?
I don't have any idea, but let me tell you this. I was a police officer, I was a police sergeant, I was a police legal advisor and a prosecutor. I really don't care what one investigator thought. They're so often wrong. And they're so often supervised, and people with more stars and stripes on their shirt get a chance to make those final decisions. And the decision after calmer heads were brought into the table were, hey, we got a statute says we should not arrest if self-defense is claimed and there's some reasonable evidence that supports it, and there's not pretty much overwhelming evidence to contradict it. Someone tell me what the evidence was to contradict it. Does that answer the question as to why we think he had a pretty good self-defense argument?
Mr. Uhrig, you seem to have made this case very much about race. You said the first question, the number one question, is whether or not Newman's a racist. First of all, who has called Newman a racist? I haven't heard any member of Trayvon Martin's family say that, but you seem to really be fixating your defense of him.
Let me say why I do that, okay? And it has absolutely nothing to do with the court case, unless the feds came in and made it a hate crime based upon whatever criteria they applied. The reason it's important is because we've had two cases going at the same time. There's the case of whether or not George Zimmerman acted in self-defense and therefore was justified in his actions, which resulted in the tragic death of a 17-year-old young man. But anyone who has not been living in a cave and who has a television anywhere near him has seen the rallies, read the reports on the television, read the reports on the internet, heard Congresswoman get up there with a microphone and say, Trayvon Martin, innocent young boy, stalked, racially profiled, stalked like a dog, and shot down in the street. Someone tell me that they don't think that was a racially charged statement by that Congresswoman. All right? And it's not just her. It's Jesse Jackson. It's Al Sharpton. It's the guy that came down from Baltimore. It's people on the net using terms like murderer. All right? If you don't believe that this has been largely couched in racial terms, listen to what I'm saying. If you don't believe that this has been largely couched in racial terms in the media, you're not watching the same TV stations, you're not reading the same blogs, you're not looking on the internet. Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this in terms of the way, and I'm taking a shot at the press when I say this. Something terrible happens, and it gets couched. If you go on the internet today, on some of your stations, you're going to see a picture of a 12-year-old young black man named Trayvon Martin, picture taken 5 years ago, looks like he's just leaving choir practice. Doesn't look much like the picture that he posted on his Twitter account, shooting the famous middle finger at the camera and choosing a website name that I won't even repeat. And you got a picture of George Martin from a booking photograph from years ago, from an arrest for which he was eventually exonerated and the charges were dropped. Those are the pictures. Why not have the picture that is on some sites now with George as he looks more today in a coat and a tie and Trayvon Martin at over 6 feet tall, instead of characterizing this as big mean man tracks down poor little boy? There's a difference between following and still being able to see the guy go down between the buildings, okay? First of all, even though it's our position he did not follow him after he said okay, it would not have been unlawful or even improper to follow him. You can follow me home if you want to. Heck, you can come in for dinner, all right? If you say something ugly to me, hopefully I'll disagree, but I'm not going to turn around and break your nose. What becomes important is the moment in time when somebody confronted somebody and the first person went from sticks and stones can break my bones, words can never hurt me. The first person that swung, as far as we can tell, was Trayvon Martin. That's what changed the character of this entire situation from one of what might have been an unfortunate misunderstanding into a crime. And the crime was battery against George Zimmerman.
Still, that means he's not turning his back to go and check the number. He's still following.
He'd already gone. No, he had to go to the end to get the number, and he's coming back towards his car.
Last question, sir. Do you agree as an ex-police officer that this case, as much as raises questions about gun laws in the state, and that this might not have happened if he hadn't been carrying a weapon?
Absolutely not.
Isn't the statute a bad one?
No, the statute's not a bad one. It wouldn't have happened if either one of them left a half hour earlier or a half hour later. Chance plays a large role in things that wind up happening. This is a gun law consistent in about 23 or 24 other states. What it basically says is nothing new. It says if you are confronted by someone and physically attacked and you are in reasonable fear for your safety, you're entitled to defend yourself. The statute's got four legs to that stool. You got to be someplace where you're allowed to be. Both of them were. You got to be not doing anything illegal. As far as we know, both of them were. And you cannot be the first physical aggressor. Not the first, hey, I want to call you a bad name or call your mama a bad name. The first physical aggressor. The only evidence, and most of the forensics support the fact that that was Trayvon Martin. When that happens, and let me tell you what the mortician said about Trayvon Martin. What he said on his little announcement was, other than the bullet hole, I didn't find any injuries on Trayvon Martin. And I guess he was intending to say that he didn't see the, did you want to outshout me or did you want to go talk to somebody else?
We can go there.
I'm answering a question. You can stay out of it. Anyhow.
Answer it true.
What the mortician said was, I didn't see any injuries. He didn't have a broken nose. He didn't have scars on the back of his head. You won't find any photographs of those. You won't find a witness to come in and say that. All right? The gun law is a good law because what it does is it gives honest citizens the right to carry a weapon. I've got a carry permit. Many people in Florida have a carry permit. The Second Amendment permits us to have weapons. There are people that are anti-gun to the bone. I disagree with you, but I respect your opinion. But it doesn't make it a bad law. If you take the guns away from the good people, then the punks and thugs know you're unarmed and you're open season. So there's all kinds of reasons. It's a discussion for another day that would take hours. I don't take any exception to the law itself, and I don't think that the law in this case is going to be applied in such a way that it's unreasonable. Depends on what the provoke is. If following you is provocation, it's not allowed. If you follow me and curse at me all the way, I can't turn around and physically attack you over it. So provocation is not being at the same location at the same time. Whoever decides to turn it from a war of words into a war of fists does so at their peril. It's a matter of bad judgment. I'm sorry. No, I'm not accepting the fact. I'm saying even if there had been, as far as we know, George Zimmerman was on the only account from anyone who was actually there is that there was no confrontation. He had gotten the address and was walking peacefully back to his car when he was confronted by Trayvon Martin. I wasn't there. I don't know. Don't have a clue. What I'm telling you is the only evidence supports that version.